Teachers, what's the dumbest question a student has ever asked you? Story 1. Not a question, but more of a statement that prompted a whole discussion when I was student teaching. To set the stage, I would like to point out that I am white and my leading teacher was African American, and the classroom was about 60% African American, 30% Latino, and the remaining 10% a mixture of Asian and white. This was also my advanced class, and we were discussing the apartheid in Africa. Me, so the black Africans and white Africans. Student raises hand. Miss Ducky, you can't say that. Me, say what? Student, black. It's African American. Me, trying my hardest not to die a little inside. No, that is actually not the correct phrase. Can anyone tell me why African American is not the correct term for this situation? Silence. Me. Okay guys, look at it this way. Are we talking about Americans? No, we are not. We are talking about a racial issue in Africa with no relation to America at all. The definition of African American is a person of African descent living in America, so if the people we are talking about are not American, they cannot be African American, can they? So to talk about the racial issue, the labels used are Black Africans and White Africans, as outlined by our textbook. Student, no, you can't say that. They are African American. At this point, my lead teacher is face-palming. She is in total disbelief, and as much as she loved to watch me struggle, she stepped in and tried to explain it as well. 20 minutes go by of the two of us trying our best. The bell rings. The kids still couldn't figure it out. I think we both nearly cried. Story 2. Grade 5 sex ed. I had a rule that any question can be asked, but I might ask you to ask your parents instead of me. I heard a story about a man who put his stuff into muffins and fed it to grade 1 kids. Well, that is pretty disgusting, and I would think that person would go to jail for doing that. Wouldn't the girls get pregnant from eating it? And before I could say anything, another student blurted out, "No, they wouldn't get pregnant. They haven't gone through puberty yet." I am thankful for days when kids remind me that they are still kids. When I was in grade 5 sex ed, we were allowed to write down our questions for privacy, and the teacher would read them aloud. Having just viewed an episode of Ally McBeal that included a transgender woman who still had a penis, my question became, if a woman has a penis, does it still work the same? I remember him opening up my question, staring at it, folding it up, and moving on. Story 3. Not a teacher, but in my senior year of high school, I was in a personal finance class. The teacher explained that not paying your taxes could get you incarcerated. Student, so if you don't pay your taxes, the government will light you on fire? Teacher, no, incarcerated means to imprison. You're thinking of incinerated. Student, oh, wait, then what's taxidermy? Story 4. Wasn't a teacher, a lifeguard on a beach. Man with a very thick Chicago accent asked me where the switch was to turn off the waves so he could let his daughter go out and play in the water. So I told him it was at my boss's stand. I would have said they put it on the moon in the 60s, because people kept messing with it, and there's a secret war over whether or not governments should have power to turn off the waves and sabotage all attempts to get to the moon, which is why no one has been back. Story 5. My wife is the teacher, but this is my favorite story of hers. They were discussing how Native Americans relied on hunting buffalo and used all parts of it for food, clothing, shelter, etc. In reference to how they used the buffalo for shelter, one student asked, "So, do they stack the buffalo on top of each other?" Story 6. Taught English and literature in a juvenile justice long-term treatment facility. I have many great stories. Me. This is a map of the United States. Here is the Midwest. It's where your math teacher is from. Student. Oh, snap, we're in a war with them. Me. Are you thinking about the Middle East? Student. Oh, yeah, is that a different place? Me. Playing a trivia game with students. Johannes Gutenberg invented what? Student. Shoots his hand up in the air quickly before I even finish the question, and very sure of his answer. Cheese! Student. Reading The Three Little Pigs out loud. And the big bad wolf huffed, and he puffed, and he passed it around. Me. I've never heard of that version of the story before, Mr. Student. Student. You wouldn't, Mr. Ellipses. It's the hood version. Story 7. Had a student ask me, what are those pyramid-shaped things in Egypt called? Never seen a class laugh that hard before. My wife worked with a woman in the Senate. They were staffers a long time ago, just out of college. She, not my wife, said, "The Pentagon? Isn't that the hexagon-shaped building?" Story 8. Warm spring day, no AC. Fan blowing in the front of the room. Hand goes up. Can you make the fan ovulate? No, I can't. Story 9. I'm a corporate trainer, so hopefully this counts. I used to train content for an exam that everyone in our field must take to get licensed. If you didn't pass, you had to go back through the course. Well, I had a dude go through my class 4 times. 4. Here's the conversation we had before his 3rd exam. Guy: what attempt am I on? Me: wait, what? Guy: well, I've taken the test twice, but everyone else in here hasn't taken it. So am I taking my test for the 1st time or the 3rd time? Me: what do you think? Guy: I don't know, that's why I'm asking you. Dude thought that he might be on his 1st attempt because he was back in a class with a bunch of people who were on theirs. Story 10. I was a maths teacher. One day, a student, apropos of nothing, right at the start of the class, looked me dead in the eyes and asked me, how did Jesus nail his other hand to the cross? He then began miming the impossible task, musing over whether he had a hammer on a rope in his mouth, and swung his head side to side to insert the final nail. He didn't, I replied. Oh, said the student with a long pause. That makes sense. That is the story of my one stupid question. Story 11. I used to volunteer teaching at an after-school program for 14-year-olds. We were doing a project that involved balloons. One boy had blown his balloon but couldn't get it tied. I tied it and gave it back to him. He immediately tossed it up. As it sank to the floor, his face fell. Obviously disappointed, he asked, "Aw, so they're not helium?" For those wondering, we did have a mini science lesson that evening. I explained to him that helium is not a balloon type, but is a gas that's lighter than air. I explained that he can get helium-filled balloons at most grocery stores or places with helium tanks. I also explained that typically helium is harvested from natural gas. He was a really sweet kid, but he definitely had his fair share of these kinds of moments. Story 12. How old do you have to be to smoke crack? A fellow student at Waukegan circa 1988. Story 13. As part of teaching U.S. government, I ran a zombie apocalypse scenario where the students had to respond to an ongoing crisis in real time, using the actual powers of the government as different parts of the government. It was my favorite activity all semester, and I went all in, including with a large map of the U.S. that would be updated for every day that passed. As part of this activity, I prepared a handout of a fake news story about the zombie apocalypse beginning in our hometown. It had pictures of zombies shambling around and was written all newspaper style. One day, after handing these out, an 18-year-old student raised their hand and said, "Mr. Crosage, did this really happen?" Story 14. After a lengthy explanation of the effects of volcanic eruptions on human communities, I had a grade 6 student ask me why on earth people even make volcanic eruptions. Story 15. My wife went to school to be a high school history teacher, and when she had her semester of student teaching, one of the students asked if China had grass, while another who insisted that windmills make wind. Story 16. This came up all the time when teaching kids how to do their taxes. I must have had this conversation a dozen times. Student: Sir, I don't know what to do at this part. Me: What does the instructions say on that line? Student: Add box 23 and 24 and write the answer here. Me: So add box 23 and 24? I, to this day, have no idea how you teach someone to follow very explicit instructions. Story 17. Also not a teacher, but when I was in high school in health class while going over reproduction, there was a fellow student who raised her hand and asked if you were sterile, could you pass it on to your children? The whole class giggled and she, confused, said she was serious. She wanted to know if you're sterile, could you pass it on to your kids? The teacher, with a smile, said to her, "Okay, let's think about this. What does it mean to be sterile?" She began answering, "It means you can't have Oh! Followed by another round of laughter from the rest of the class. To her credit, they're finding that people conceived using IVF are having difficulty having children of their own as adults. So not completely a dumb question, depending on if you mean completely sterile or unable to reproduce unassisted. Story 18. At university, I had a classmate that would often show up 20 minutes late to class. The first thing he did after sitting down was raise his hand to ask questions about what the professor had just said, question after question, until he had caught up with the rest of the class. Absolutely infuriating. Story 19. In 7th grade science class during sex ed, they were talking about oral sex. Mormon girl in class: "Wait, you can get an STD just from talking about sex?" I wouldn't call the question stupid, just no exposure at all to the topic beforehand. Story 20. 9th grade ELA, a few chapters into Of Mice and Men. What kind of work does George do on the farm? I'm not sure. probably the same work that everyone else is doing. Oh, it must be hard for him to help out, since he's a mouse. Story 21. Not really a teacher, but I'm a federal budget analyst and had to train a new employee who had apparently been working in budgets for 20 years or so should have been able to quickly pick things up. She wasn't. When I finally got her on the right track with our year-end financial reports, I told her she was close, but her numbers were off, so double-check them. She responded with, well, wouldn't someone else just fix that? No. That's exactly what you get paid to do, so you need to put the correct numbers in the report so we can publish it. What on earth would we do with almost correct financial reports? The next day, she just couldn't figure it out, and I said, you're really close. It's probably just rounding. She said, does it matter? How do you know when you should round it up or down? I said, yes, it matters. Just use normal rounding rules. She asked what those are. I very slowly said, 0.5 or higher you round up? She had never been familiarized with that apparently. In the end, I really felt like I would have been better off teaching a third grader. Story 22. My degree is in IT, but we were required to take an accounting class. Almost everyone in the class was a business major of some sort, with a good half of them going for accounting specifically. By the second week, it had devolved into basic math lessons, because an overwhelming number of students didn't understand the concept of 0.1 equals 10% equals 1/10. It sucked for me, because the professor was really good and I otherwise enjoyed it. We just lost a lot of time to elementary level math in a college course. Story 23. At the college midterm, I had a guy come up to me that I've never seen in class. He proceeded to ask me what his grade is. Checked the sheet. He never turned in a single piece of homework. No quizzes, never attended a test. What did you think you'd have? You've got a solid F. Story 24. Have a friend who is a professor. He told me about a student that was failing pretty hard. Near the end of the term, the student pleaded for extra credit to bring his grade up. My friend, being an understanding guy, eventually relented, saying, if you do X, I'll give you a passing grade. My friend never heard from the student again until the grades came out for that term, and naturally, the student failed because he didn't do the extra credit work. The student was pissed and actually tried issuing a complaint with the dean about my friend. He hasn't offered extra credit since. Story 25. Sorry, I'm not a teacher, but this was a question my teacher asked a student in my philosophy class. Community college. Teacher, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it must be... Points at a random student for an answer. Random student. Man, I have no idea. Story 26. Ugh, this kid. I'm sure everyone has one in their grade. The type that is told his answer is wrong, but somehow won't accept it and defends his factually wrong answer with the weirdest bullshit logic. It was the year that the game Fable came out, and the slogan was, for every decision, a million outcomes. This kid was in my 9th grade English class, and we were learning about actual fables. The kid asked the teacher, doesn't the word fable mean for a single decision there's a million outcomes? Cue everyone in the class slowly turning their heads to look at him. The teacher said, no, fable is a short story or tale used to establish or show ethics and morals. Something along those lines, aka the actual meaning of the word fable. The kid goes, oh, well, I think you're wrong, because there's this game that came out, and in the commercials it says, for every decision there's a million outcomes. The teacher and this kid literally argued about the meaning of the word fable for like half an hour in class, and everyone's telling the kid he's wrong, and he refuses to accept it, because the commercial said otherwise. He didn't actually use the word otherwise, I'm sure that it's out of his vocabulary range, but he refused to relent. Fucking Ryan, shut the fuck up. Story 27. I was asked by a crying student once if there was a second moon. We were outside for recess, and as happens sometimes, the moon was visible. I said, nope, why? And she pointed to the moon and asked, but aren't the sun and the moon the same thing? 4th grade student, not special needs or anything. She was crying because the other kids were making fun of her for thinking the sun and the moon were the same thing. After I explained to her the sun did not turn into the moon at night and then back into the sun in the morning, she actually thought the moon was the sun turned off, I did an impromptu science lesson that afternoon with the whole class. Story 28. Most of the idiotic questions I get are always linked to history, though I'm an English teacher. They have no idea about different time periods or a sense of centuries. So I get questions such as, why didn't Dickens just get on a plane? Was the internet not around then? Then being the 1700s. Were the Victorians around when dinosaurs were? And these are 14 to 16-year-olds. It gets even harder for them when thinking about the few decades prior to their existence, i.e. the 50s to 90s. I wonder if we are all like that a little when we're so young. Story 29. 10th grade honors chemistry. Topic is states of matter. What would liquid ice be called? We're still not sure if he was making a joke about the short-lived Icebreakers mints liquid ice because everyone was laughing too hard. Story 30. I'm a casual lecturer and have a young family, so only work the hours I'm paid. Quite often I'll get a student not show for the entire semester, then in the last week appear and ask why I can't teach them out of hours. There have been tears and complaints when I've basically said that if they'd shown up to class, they'd know what they were doing, and I have better things to do with my life than support lazy students. Story 31. Not a teacher, but a tutor, and not really a question, but was trying to explain to one girl doing her GCSEs how the start of the word for the alkanes shows how many carbon atoms there are, e.g. like octane has 8 and decane has 10, etc. Asked her how many pentane had. She didn't know. Asked her how many sides a pentagon has. She didn't know. Proceeded to blow her mind by drawing a pentagon. Turns out she had never come across the concept of a 5-sided shape before. Story 32. As an older student going to college, one thing stands out for me. We were discussing the coastal flooding attributed to the melting of the ice caps, and the kid asked the professor what the big deal was. The land was lifting as fast as the sea was rising anyway. The professor stopped to digest that for a moment. The kid went on to say that the flooding wasn't a worry because all of the world's coastlines were constantly lifting up out of the ocean depths. Story 33. Not a teacher, but in my 8th grade sex ed class, we had a box where students could submit questions anonymously. One day, the teacher read aloud one of the questions, which asked, "My dad's is circumcised, but mine is not. Does this mean he isn't my dad?" Yes, he believed circumcision was hereditary. Story 34. My cousin is a teacher, and one day he had to teach a sex ed unit to the class. You know, the ones where everyone splits off into boy and girl groups so that they can put any question in a hat and have it answered anonymously. He is a guy, so he was answering the questions for the boys. So he got some questions that were clearly looking for stupid answers, and threw them out. As usual, certain jokers were trying to get a rise out of him. Then he got a question that asked, "Why do you have to have an erection to have sex with a girl?" This one he couldn't avoid. He didn't know if it was serious or not, so he decided he would have to answer it. He said, "You know how you have the plastic tip on the end of your shoelaces to get into the hole? It's kind of like that. This may be the greatest metaphor I have ever personally heard of. Thank you for listening."